Okay.
Perfect.
Brilliant. So why don't you just start by telling me a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you so much to British Council, your team, for having me. I'm very excited about this whole session. So my name is Ankur Mahajan. I live in Canada, the capital city, Ottawa. I work for the federal government here. I've been here for a couple of years. Regarding my background, I was educated at Purdue University in the US. So that's where I finished my education in the US, and then I did my master's from Cardiff University in the UK.
I went to Cardiff University. Yeah.
Wonderful. So you probably can relate to a lot of experiences of going to the CBD and other places, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I did another master's from Memorial University in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a year in Sydney, Australia, studying at Charles Sturt University. And then I lived and worked in various capacities for international organizations and private sector in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, India, Afghanistan, China, Indonesia, and a couple of years in Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. And based on all those experiences, I authored my book. So it's called Life Beyond Bullets.
Nice.
So it's all about what life is like in war zones and what you should do to fit in and to understand the development context of those places. So that's me, and I've been working for the federal government here since 2016-17 in Canada. And today we just got our first snow. So I don't know where are you right now? London?
London, yeah.
Okay, how's the weather like there?
Pretty awful, as to be expected in London. Just raining. How is the weather in Ottawa?
Yeah, we just got our first snow today. So
first snow. Fantastic.
Yeah, I don't know if you...
Lovely. Are you a big snow person?
No, not much. Well, I like to just watch it from the windows. It's very beautiful. But then when you have to step out, then it gets too much. And then, it gets about negative 25 where I live.
Wow.
So that is pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
It's cold. Yeah, that's about it from my end. And I'm really happy that I'm invited to actually share my insights, and I hope I can be helpful.
I mean, absolutely it will be. So I work for a separate kind of independent research company called Kubi Kalu, and we are a creative consumer consultancy. And we're working with British Council and Study UK Canada, Study UK, who are looking to do more kind of promotion of being able to study in the UK through Study UK Canada specific. And so we're just helping them do some desk research and to look into the processes of moving to the UK to do your study, kind of how you did those first application steps,
Absolutely.
how kind of if you faced any barriers during that process, what research you did, all of that stuff. So really focusing on primarily the UK study, and it sounds like you've had quite a fantastically international education, and sounds incredibly interesting. But just for today, I think we need to focus on Cardiff because it's Study UK.
Absolutely.
So yeah, why don't we kind of go back to the start and talk about when did you first start to think that you wanted to study abroad?
Sure. So when I was studying, I was doing my undergrad in the US. That was in 2004, I believe. There was an advertisement to do an exchange program in London for 4 months. And this is I was 19, I believe, that time. And I was like, okay, yeah, let's just give it a shot. Mm-hmm. So I ended up in London for 3.5, 4 months. And I absolutely loved it as an exchange student. I was living in Kensington and Chelsea. It was like a melting pot of all the cultures together. You can pretty much meet people from around the world. So I really loved it. And then after that experience, I went back to the US, and then I thought, you know what, maybe I'll look into a master's degree from Cardiff or any of the universities. So my first thought was, the reason I chose UK was, firstly, it was just to experience the culture coming from, after studying from the US. The other thing was a master's degree in the UK was 1 year compared to 2 years in the US. So, and it was valid all around the world. So that was another reason, because education can be very expensive, whether you're in the UK or in the US. So, and then so then because of that, I applied to 4 universities in the UK. And another reason was that my sister was already living in the UK. So that made the transition a bit more easier too, in a way. I applied to, I believe, Edinburgh, LSE, Cardiff, and Manchester, mostly the bigger cities. And then I got accepted from Cardiff, but I wasn't sure whether to go to Cardiff or not. So I did some research. And at that time, Cardiff was actually one of the top 10 places for university residences in terms of living for students, student life in general. So that was one of the factors that really encouraged me to go to Cardiff. And then the program that I had chosen was Masters in International Economics, Banking, and Finance. It sounded very interesting because I wanted a career in finance and economics. So that was one of the reasons, again, the reputation of the program, university, just my desire to live in the UK for a bit, and having a 1 year master's compared to 2 years in the US. So then once I applied, I got the acceptance. I believe the visa process wasn't too tedious. I applied to there was an embassy in Chicago. I went there and I got it in like 1 or 2 days. So it wasn't too bad at that time, but this is 2005 and 6 I'm talking about. So it's been a while. So I'm not acquainted with the processes right now, but that time was quite smooth in the US. And yes, so that was mostly the reasons that I applied to study in UK, and I think I never regretted it because I mean I learned so much from staying in the UK, and then just because it's a melting pot, so you not only learn from the British culture, but you learn from people around you, you know. And actually, I do have a small presentation to show you on challenges.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe
Go
I
for
will share it with you later on.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
So-
So in terms of applying for university, did you go directly to the universities themselves, or did you go through kind of a program?
No, actually, I just went straight to the university websites, and I remember. I think the process was a bit tedious, but wasn't too bad in terms of giving the information to the applicants in terms of what you need to apply for. One thing I would actually suggest is this is about 2005 6. I had to mail my application, so mailing my application and then mailing a transcripts from universities that I had attended in high school. That was more of an issue. But now I think the process has changed. You have a central database where you just send out everything from there and it's pretty instant. But during that time, I believe I had to contact my high school and my university and then send actually hard copies to all the universities I was applying. So that must have changed now. I think so.
Yeah.
So that was one thing I remember that was more tedious. And apart from that, I think, yes, I think the whole process was quite smooth. I got a response in 2 or 3 months from university, and then I was able to decide and then, yeah, pay my tuition initially and then where I want to go. So wasn't that bad. But I think I do have like some pointers what I saw barriers and challenges that other people faced. So if you allow me, maybe I can share the presentation. Are you okay with it?
Do you have?
Yeah, just give me 2 seconds. Can you see my screen? All right, perfect. So, I actually contacted. We have a WhatsApp group of other students from Cardiff, and they were very helpful. So they also shared some of the tips from their end, and I've tried to combine everything. So I hope this will be helpful to you.
Oh, you've muted yourself. Sorry. Oh.
Technology. There you go. It's okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I remember when I was applying from the US, one thing wasn't clear because what kind of GPA do I need to apply to the universities? So that was, I had to just sort of figure out and just apply and just fingers crossed, what is the equivalent of saying first class or second class in the UK or A levels? Because I was coming from the education system in the US, so it was quite different. Like I said, mailing transcripts was the other issue. When I started traveling, Ellie, so this was in African nations and other places that I went, I met people and a lot of them complained about fraudulent consultants because I believe people are quite innocent when they don't know how to go about and they can be easily trusted. So that's one thing maybe the British Council can work on, is just making sure that the information is quite transparent, and then they should maybe have a number or something where people can, students can directly contact them and not being, a victim of some fraudulent consultant who's charging them buckload of money and then absolutely not doing much for them. So that's one thing, maybe have the information more transparent on their websites, and then where you can call them. And I think the process is very straightforward, but it can be quite tedious, especially if you're a high school student. So you don't have that experience and then you trust consultants. And that's one of the pointers, I think. The other thing was the cultural experiences. If you allow me to speak on this right now. Okay, so when I was there, you have people coming from all around the world in the UK. And so some people are stepping out of their houses to another country for the first time. So that can be a very daunting experience for a lot of them. So in that ways, I think what British Council can do is just make sure that the transition is more smoother in terms of culture. Because when I was in the UK, I realized, it's not that you're just meeting British people, you're meeting people from other parts of the world. And some cultures can be quite direct, like Russians or Finnish, and which might not be similar in African cultures. So that whole social etiquette, I think if the universities can share on their website, that could be a lot more easier. Or maybe provide them links, before they come, like what's it like here. Living with international students, I thought I learned a lot by living with people of different backgrounds, but it also has its own disadvantages sometimes because the cultures can clash, right? Your food habits might be different, your other habits might be different. So that's one more thing I think that if the students can be aware of it beforehand, it can help them. Language ESL, so already a master's program is quite intense, right? And then if you're coming from culture where you don't speak English as your first language, it adds another barrier to the whole program, to the whole thing. So that's one thing that I thought, people do struggle. And the other thing is when you're new to the country, you kind of want to relate to people of your background, and that's when if you have student groups like Latin student groups, South Asian groups, African student bodies, right, that can help you to adapt a lot more faster. And dealing with winters, coming from the US, it was still okay, but then, sometimes you're coming from places you're not used to of seeing snow or living in winters, and that time finding affordable clothing can be an issue because, you don't just want to go to the Cardiff city center and go to the first shop and buy something which is way more expensive than what you can afford. So having that sort of resource can help a lot. And then, money can be tight for students, especially international students. So having that resources that where you can go shop under your budget can help a lot. And finding international stores, if you crave something like a Polish cuisine or something from your own cultural background, that can also help you to adapt to the new university lifestyle. And let me move on to the other slide. Access to services. So that is another thing when I realized when I came to Cardiff, was just it will be easier to have more signposts because you're literally lost in a jungle of buildings.
Mhm.
And it can be very hard and daunting, like where is your class, where to go and stuff. So that could help having more signposts.
Mhm.
Information on off-campus housing. So now this is a big one because many times whenever I studied in other parts of the world, right, I had some sort of information on off-campus housing. But when I was in Cardiff, I mean, I didn't know anybody in the city, nothing. So I just applied directly to the residents that Cardiff had to offer. It was in Column Hall. So I believe it was a lot more expensive later on that I realized that what you can get in off campus.
Yeah.
But not having that information before, you end up signing a contract and then you can't back out of it. So if you have more information about where you can find cheaper accommodation, that can help a lot, especially if you've never been to the country before and you have nobody in that city who can help you. The other thing is food banks, in case something goes wrong, it is good to know. Cheaper furniture if you're trying to move to a off-campus housing, where to find that. Affordable clothing, like I mentioned before. Access to language services, banking services. So yes, I believe we had 160 people in our master's program, and I think 140 and 130 of them were international students. And many didn't speak English as their first language. So having access to language services can be quite helpful. And same thing with banking services, because I remember I just opened an account with the very next bank to my house. That was, I believe, was NatWest, but not knowing that, there were more options might have changed my decision. So it's one thing. Legal advice, maybe universities can also help you in terms of giving, in case you get into a contract with a landlord, then they can actually guide you where to go and get more information. And then also advise international students, especially when they're 18 and 19, to not just sign any contract without making sure you know what you're getting into. Legality of work, I believe it was 20 hours a week or something, but knowing that how much you can work as an international student can help you a lot too. Reporting discrimination and bullying, like I said, you're living with people of different cultures and different ethnicities. That could be helpful if you ever face any kind of scenarios of discrimination and bullying. You should know where to report them. Areas to avoid, again, like in Cardiff, I didn't know what areas not to go. So this could be helpful if you're a minority or a woman, especially to avoid those areas at a certain time. Meeting a friend. So this is something we have in the US and maybe something in the UK as well. They can think about is having an accountability buddy. So initially when you start universities, so you can have a local student who can just check up on your well-being after a month or two, just to make sure you're okay, you're adapting well. Even a small message or a phone call can just help you boost your morale and make you more comfortable in a new place. Introvert personalities and with online teaching. So nowadays, a lot of these classes are online. So that can also add another pressure because you're not having face-to-face interaction. So make sure that the professors do have these face-to-face interactions with students so nobody's left behind to check on them. Commuting to classes. So I remember that time we didn't have any Uber and taxis were quite expensive. So knowing your way, how to get to a class, the public transport can also help. If the universities can add that on their website, that could be helpful. Medical services, that's the other thing. I didn't know much about NHS beforehand, how to get the NHS number, and I believe there was no help from Cardiff that time. So you just literally had to figure out everything yourself. So that can, again, help a lot if you're new to the country as an international student. I also saw during my program at Cardiff, there were a lot of unconventional students. I was about 22 that time, 21, 22. So I was literally people around my age. So, okay. But then there were a lot of people who had children and, were at a different life stage. So it would be helpful if you have more resources like childcare, spouse employment services for students who are coming for from a different unconventional background. So also how to meet people of similar age groups. And a lot of times we don't realize that when you're coming to the UK, you might be used to of having physical punishments for kids in a certain culture being acceptable, but not being acceptable in the UK. So giving them the cultural understanding, what is okay, what is not, can help. Just ensuring mature students don't feel left out in general. The other thing I realized was the political context. UK is an open place. We need to ensure that there is no disrespect shown to different cultures, religion, and people of different orientations. So coming from certain conservative backgrounds, you might not be aware of this. So that's another thing. When I was in Cardiff, people might not realize that saying something can be very offensive to certain people. So having that cultural understanding, acknowledgement can really help. Use of certain words can be racist. So certain language, knowing that LGBTQ community is accepted, that's the other thing, coming from conservative background, religious backgrounds. The legal aspects, like knowing abortions are legal, and then there's less stigma involved with certain things. So I think that can help students prepare a lot better in future. Regarding academics and career, when I was at Cardiff, I realized it would be helpful to have more resources for students who struggle, like counseling services, extra classes. So, so nobody's left behind. The language barriers. So professors have to have more patience. So that's one thing. Failing can be a difficult experience for international students, considering the financial burden. So again, you don't want to, make sure that students don't have anxiety and depression because of failing grades. Lack of career counseling, once I graduated or was during the last months of my graduation, there was no career counseling at Cardiff. So not knowing what jobs are in demand and any CV support that I can get, that was lacking. I believe that's something that the universities can work on. And also, if you're international, knowing what companies can hire you and sponsor your visas, that could be very useful. And then overall, like having a feedback form, right? Once I graduated, I would like to let you know that what can be done better. I think there was no monitoring mechanism. There was no feedback from all the graduates. So that could help if every university can think about sending a memo or a small little, feedback form to all the graduates to know what they think could be done. So, yeah, I think these were the points that I could come out with quickly.
Yeah, no, that was brilliant. Really interesting. Thank you. With regards to cost, I feel like the burden cost came up quite a lot.
Yes.
So how, kind of more specifically focusing just on Canadian students,
Yes.
how do they navigate that cost? What options are there for Canadian students to get over that cost barrier?
So I know there are scholarships offered when it comes to British Council, they're offered, but most of the people that I know, the other Canadians and Americans that I met, were self-funding themselves to the UK. And this can be a challenge because, because right now, like say living in Ontario, I would pay 3/4 or half of the cost I would have to pay in the UK. So this is obviously a challenge. But what can happen, even if you cannot increase the scholarships, is financial aid. Maybe have more financial aid possible to the US and Canadian students, because I believe I met more Canadians than Americans in the UK universities, because I believe maybe it's the Commonwealth, the factor that made it easier. So that's one thing I think they can look for, is maybe even if you cannot have scholarships available, try to have more financial aid in terms of loans given to students and an option, they can pay back later on. And this could be easier because, I think Canada and the UK have very strong ties. So even if they come back to Canada, they can still pay off the loan somehow, I believe. So where I live is right next to a region called Quebec, and Quebec has a very strong relationship with France. If you study their education pattern, it might be something that you can gain from learning from between UK and Canada in general, because I think they have similar exchange programs. Some of them pay the same tuition that they would be paying here to study in France. So that's one thing. Maybe the UK universities can also look into it at a master's level. I know they do that at an undergraduate level, but that could be something that might be helpful at a master's or a PhD level to look into. The other thing was the applications. I mean, now it's been a while. I'm not acquainted with the system right now, but it was quite easier. It wasn't too bad. But I feel like the British education is not very popular in terms of, like, you need to advertise more about it, because a lot of the people I met, they would prefer to study in the US from Canada. So that's one thing. If you advertise, look into the competitive advantages of what US universities have to offer compared to how you can get better in the UK about it. So I think that's one thing. Maybe the other factor is Canada and the US are next to each other. It's easier for people to travel to the US compared to Canada. But that's one factor you can look into it, is just how to make sure you attract more students. I think there's a lot of people. And then where you can start is having more exchange programs as undergraduation. Like in my case, like having just like a 3-month program that can give you a taste of the British life and British education. And then once you graduate, you can look for a full-time degree there. So have more stronger exchange programs at a high school level and at undergraduation level. So people once they've been to a certain culture, they're more comfortable to go back into it, because the uncertainty factor is not there anymore.
Okay. And but we kind of touched like a little bit on your kind of motivations of going to the UK, and that was the 1-year study. You wanted to experience the culture, and your sister was there as well, so it made the transition a lot easier. What were some of your perceptions of the UK before you moved there?
Okay, so there are certain cultural differences. I mean, the perception of the UK was like, this is, when I was studying the US, people would just go to classes in flip-flops and sweatshirts. But when I was living in London, it wasn't like that. People were dressing up to the classes all the time. So it just creates a perception that, people are more conscious about when they step out of the houses, that how they're looking. So that was one perception, I think, that I had of British people, and which to some extent was very true when I was living in London and Cardiff as well. And overall, I think the education system, because I mean, I had heard a lot about Oxford, Cambridge, and all the big universities as a focal point for research around the world. So I know the education is of higher quality for sure. And in the US, when I was living that time, it was a bit of a craze to go to the UK, because a lot of the people, I think, the other thing is because London is closer to New York and other places, so a lot of people travel to the first destination in Europe is generally London or Paris. So of course there's more people inclined towards, so the British culture is more common, I think, in the US compared to Canada. The perception, maybe it's because the movies, the history in other places, other things. So yes, that was one of my perceptions before I went. The other thing I realized was very different is that when I was in undergraduation in the US, we had every class had an attendance requirement. So if you don't show up for 3 classes without a reason, they will fail you. You might be getting A's in your classes, they'll still fail you. In the UK, I find that was not, maybe because I was a master's student, so they assume you're more professional, you're more matured, but there was no attendance requirements. So sometimes that could also be a disadvantage, I believe, because sometimes you don't show up to classes for weeks and weeks, and then you just study couple of days before the exam to pass. Well, you do get the knowledge, but it's not like, because in my opinion, a lot of your studies from university should make you a disciplined human being. You should be able to organize your day in a way it's more productive, not like weeks of doing nothing and then 5 days of just cramming everything. So that's one thing I think the universities can look into. It's just having more sort of regular communication with the students. So making sure that they're also coming to classes, because, you know, the whole point of university is to make you ready for your work, for your professional life. And in professional life, not showing up to work for a couple of days is not going to be good for you, for sure. So I think university should adapt the same kind of view. And in that ways, I think the US universities were much better in that ways. I mean, just being very honest, I think.
No, of course.
Then again, my experience is based on undergraduation in the US and a master's degree in the UK. It might be the same culture for master's degree in the US, I'm not sure. But that's one thing I saw, that there was no more emphasis given on attendance in the US.
Before you moved to the UK and did your masters, what kind of views did you have of the UK before you moved there, before you got to experience it?
Oh, so before my exchange program? Oh, actually, I mean, I had, you know, my experiences came from movies, some of it, and also from the royal family, because that's pretty much known all around the world. So, and from the history, especially the rich history, British history, and that really was the point in terms of just having the curiosity of knowing what Britain is about. I think so. My perception of the UK was mostly, one thing was it is expensive. I mean, was true, because pounds is much more stronger than most of the currencies. Yeah, I think it was just the whole idea that it was a melting point. So, and that was my perception, and I think to some extent it was very true.
So, what are some of the most popular destinations for Canadian students to study abroad, do you think?
Oh, Australia. Australia. For sure. The other thing, if you want to encourage students from the US and Canada, it's just the visa processes, because I believe as a Canadian, you can get a working holiday visa in Australia for 1 or 2 years. So I see a lot of people. When I was in Australia, I met a lot of people from Canada as well. So that's one thing you can look into it. Yes, Australia is a very common destination, as well as the US. US because it's a close proximity. But I mean, that's one thing. Australia is a lot more common, I think.
So do you think Australia and the US are a bit more popular than the UK as a kind of a higher education alternative?
Well, I'm not sure about the stats, but in terms of higher education, when you're talking about, we have there is some still brain drain from Canada to the US. So a lot of people move to the US after, I'm not sure if it's still happening, but that is one thing that I saw beforehand. Yes. Yeah, US and for sure is much more common destination. Also, it's a close proximity, right? So if you're moving to Canada, you can always visit your parents more often, or your family, come back to Canada.
So with regards to the reputation of the UK's higher education, what do you think is the reputation of the UK's higher education in Canada?
Oh, it's still, I mean, working in federal government, I've met people who have studied in the UK. So the degrees are very much valid. The education is considered high quality for sure. But I think there is a close relationship for sure between between Canada and the UK. So the quality of education is higher. The degrees are valid, but it's just that I don't feel like it's much more common for Canadians to go to the UK. But yes, the education, the whole perspective of education is quite positive.
Do you think Canadian, like young Canadians, have any negative perceptions of the UK at the moment?
Well, as of now, I don't really see anything negative because maybe politically there might be a little issues here and there, but or if something that pops up in the news regarding a certain crime or something, and that could change. One thing being that, of course, UK, the real estate, the rental value is pretty high, so that can also, deter people, students especially. But apart from that, there's no perception of dislike. I've never seen anything like that here. If anything, it's positive that people want to study abroad and then study in the UK as a destination. But finding those barriers to overcome is something different. Making sure you're financially capable of studying there, and then the other issues.
So with regards to kind of like pre-connotative perceptions of the UK versus then when you came over, what were some really big differences that you noticed yourself when you travelled to the UK versus what you knew of the UK?
One thing I think was like coming from the US that time studying, we had so many restaurants open during, like around midnight or 1 a.m, like fast food joints where students can study and like work or like grab a quick snack. But that in Cardiff was absolutely missing. There's 7 or 8, like you can study at the Union, but that shuts off pretty soon as well. So literally you don't have much of the options to have a group study in public places. So that's something, the perception I feel like, it's different again if you're living in metropolitan cities like London, but Cardiff was one thing that I feel like I was lacking was, it's not the social life, but it's just having a, platform where you can study late night with your colleagues and friends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's one thing they can, obviously, there was an issue. And then again, clothing, that was a perception, you just have to be more conscious about your clothing when you're going to classrooms, unlike in North America. So,
so people were a bit more, like dressed a bit more formally when they went into university in the UK than they maybe did at the US.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The environment here is a lot more casual in North America.
So would you recommend then studying in the UK to other Canadian students? Absolutely.
I think it really will broaden horizons because what I learned from the university was, it's invaluable, valuable. It helped me a lot with my career. But it's not just the education that you study, that you get from the classrooms, but by living with other people, communicating with other people. I feel like the UK is a lot more diverse than many universities that have been. So that is a very valuable education that you can get. And so I would really recommend studying in the UK for sure. And I think maybe also if you can work for a bit to understand what the professional setting is like, that can also change your mindset. But yes, I'm always pro British education.
Did you get the opportunity to work after your master's?
Just left straight away. I had a job offer, so I left straight away back to the US. So,
did you look into potentially staying in the UK at all, or?
Maybe after a year or something, I was thinking of getting back to the UK, but then it was more complicated. But when I looked into it, there was not much of career counseling. And talking to my friends that time who were looking for work, you have to find your own way out. So that was one of my points in the presentation, is to have more career counseling. So if you go to any of the US and Canadian universities, they do have a very strong emphasis on how you can translate your skills to the professional world, the jobs that are in market. But at Cardiff, I remember this was an issue for sure. Maybe I wasn't really looking strongly into getting a position within the UK, but even CV support, how to change, edit your CV to the British market wasn't there.
Okay.
So that's one thing for sure to work on, if to get a more competitive edge.
Brilliant. Those are all the questions I have for you today. Is there anything that you think I have missed that you feel like is worth speaking about?
Well, I think I tried to share most of the stuff in my presentation. Sorry, it was a very quick presentation.
No,
It's nice. Might just have little errors and issues here and there, but I want people to study in the UK, and I'm happy to if I can help somehow and mentor someone to make sure that they're more ready to adapt to the environment there. And I think nowadays, I think with the political, sometimes you hear it about the UK in the news about the economy and all. But that being said, that should not affect students too much, as long as the safety aspect is there. So, that was one of my points before I was coming to the UK, is to make sure that the city that I'm going to be is safe. So yes, I think that's one point maybe I missed in my presentation.
No, thank you.
Yes, that's about it. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been really interesting hearing about your experience in the UK, and I mean, as someone who studied in Cardiff, it's very interesting to hear about it from an international student perspective as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to your team and British Council as well.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a good one too, Ali. Bye-bye then.
Bye.